With your host, Adrian Younge.
I'd like to introduce you to a very important author, journalist, music and cultural critic, filmmaker. I can go on and on. Someone that has served as a pioneer in revising the way that mainstream media interprets Black excellence. A Brooklyn native, even though I'm talking to him right now in Silver Lake, California. I give to you none other than my friend, my brother, Mr. Nelson George. How are you, man?
Yeah, good to be with you today. Good to be with you today.
It's good to be with you too. You know, I don't get to see you as often, but at least I get to hear your voice on.
Well, hopefully one day this year we'll be able to go back and do the shows from live on
I know.
Yeah, man.
I know, man.
I need some vinyl, man.
Hey, I got you, man. We're stocked up. We're stocked up here at the Art Form Studio. But you know, I really wanted to bring you on to this podcast. You know, as you know, I've really admire everything you've done and everything you continue to do. You're a real luminary with suites of lasting value that have really helped to mold the way that people see our culture. So I'd like to start by asking, you know, what books of yours do you recommend that could help provide a more realized depiction of Black art and culture? You have so many.
I've done a lot, man. I mean, I think the two most celebrated books, three. The Deaf Rhythm and Blues from 1988, which is a look at the history of Black popular music, its evolution, and also it's sort of, it's not, I wouldn't say, I use the phrase deaf. I always just say that I use deaf in the title of that book as more a prophecy than a eulogy. Mm. That is to say that the direction it was going, and that's in the 80s, was one that was sort of taking away a lot of the spirit. And as we look to now, I mean, Deaf Rhythm and Blues, I mean, you know, for all intents and purposes, it did die as a genre. I mean, there's still artists doing it, but its vitality as a heartbeat of Black America definitely went away. So that book is important. Hip Hop America, which was done about 10 years later, it's more of a survey look at the history of hip hop, and that's development up until that point. I wrote that book. I finished that book after the death of Biggie and Tupac, and their deaths were very much a catalyst for writing and finishing that book. Actually, I've done a book on Motown, Where Let Love Go, which is a book which is my first really big book, which came out in '86. And one of my favorites that people don't really know as much about is Elevating the Game, which is a history of Black men in basketball. It came out, I think, in 1991. And why that means a lot to me is that I tried to write a sports book as if it was a music cultural book. So I used some of the same techniques to describe the work of Bill Russell, Will Chamberlain, also going back to the whole history of Black college basketball, which is a huge part of the development of Black basketball. And the big idea is that, for me, is there's a unifying aesthetic that goes through music, sports, literature. I call it in the book the BAA, the Black Athletic Aesthetic, which is basically improvisation and intimidation through improvisation. That is, the great players, you know, the fear that they it's a fear of embarrassment. It's not just they're going to score on you.
Right.
But the Stephon Curry is going to shake you to the ground, or that Iverson is going to shake you to the ground, or that, you know, Shaquille or someone's going to dunk on you and scream in your face.
Right.
You know, that's something that Black people brought to sport.
Yes.
And you know, the great basketball players are probably great dancers when you look at the footwork involved. So I always wanted to try and bring the tools of how we look at culture to sport. And I think as the game has evolved, basketball, and it was true in boxing. That's what Ali did, and Sugar Ray. It was true in baseball when Jackie Robinson and Willie Mays came into the major leagues. So whatever endeavor we get involved in, we bring a special kind of combination of improvisational nature. We're not going to play within the rules of the boundaries of the sport. but we're also going to bring a certain level of to it as well.
Well, it's a spectrum where we could better establish an equilibrium, where we can actually show that eugenically speaking, we are all of the same kind. We are not inferior people. We are not idiot savants. You know, I mean,
Right.
you see what I'm saying?
Right.
So it's one of those things where, yeah, you can say that we're not allowed to vote. We can't read. You know, we can't sit here or drink from this fountain. But when we're on that level playing field, we get to actually exhibit why we are just as American as they may be. You know.
I'll tell you something. I've been researching a project on Willie Mays, and one of the things that I didn't realize about Willie is that when he was on the field with the Giants in San Francisco, he ran the team. What I mean to say is he was the field general. So he positioned all the players on the field. He actually communicated with the catcher from center field about what pitches were being thrown and where we were going to be thrown. I had no idea basically that he was not simply a ball player in center field, that he called himself the co-manager at times. He had so much influence on what was going on. So you think of Willie Mays as this great ball player, but he was also considered an intellect of the game. He understood baseball on a very strategic level, not just a instinctual level. So when he went after, that idea that you know, to your point, that people think of these black athletes as great instinctual players, but the intellect of a Willie Mays, the intellect of a Michael Jordan, the intellect of a LeBron James, Tiger Woods, there's strategy integrated with the physical gifts.
Exactly. So, you know, it's interesting because over the years, even before we met, there's so many times where I picked up a book and read it and would see your name. And I picked up the book not knowing that you wrote it. I knew of you, but not knowing that you wrote it. And then, you know, I also collect a lot of old black magazines. And I would see your names on all these things, like, you know, from you know, we can go on and on, you know, but it's just an honor to be able to talk to you about some of your legacy and what you've been able to talk about at a time when we didn't even realize the scope of the circumstances, you know, from Michael Jackson to Bob Marley, you know, to so many. I mean, even the stuff on the Blackbirds. I mean, I think one book I definitely want to recommend to people is the mixtape, because it's just an amalgamation of some of your best articles. And one of the articles in there, or a couple of them, deal with you pioneering a new perspective in writing. When you were writing on this new thing, kind of called hip hop. And could you talk to me about what it was like to even put this article together with Kool Herc? Talk to me about that.
That's a great. So back in the summer of '78, I was a college student at St. John's University in New York, but I also was doing 2 internships. One was at the Amsterdam News, the black weekly newspaper in Harlem, and the other was at Billboard magazine, which was the #1 preeminent sort of trade publication. I was mentored by a whole group of men who really gave me a shot as a eager kid and took me under their wing. And one of them was a guy named Robert Ford, Rocky, who he just died in 2020. And he was he worked in the office. He did production. He also reviewed shows. So there was a spot in Times Square called Downstairs Records. It was in a subway station on 42nd Street and 6th Avenue. It had a really humongous collection of what they call cutout records, which were the 99 cents, $1.99, $2.99, the records that had flopped, basically, or had been discounted. And that's the spot where Herc, Grandmaster Flash, Bambaataa. It was one of those spots where all of those guys went digging, the original diggers, because they could buy in bulk. You know, you could take $10 and get 10 records. And then these guys would take the records home and literally go, nah, needle drop. Oh, yeah. They literally would go through all of these records, many of them quite obscure, looking for, you know, as we know now, that 15-second, those break beats.
Right.
So that was, I went with Rocky there one day, and he saw a flyer that this guy, Kool Herc, was doing a show in the South Bronx on a Saturday. So we were curious, and we took the train up to the Bronx, got off at Yankee Stadium, stopped 161st Street. I think it's Robert Taft High School, which was right off the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. And we walked in there, and there were kids like, you know, hanging out, waiting. As I say in the article, you know, a van pulls up, a bunch of brothers get out with crates of records, the card tables, you know, the fold-up card tables you could put up. And most crucially, they had electrical wiring. So they unscrewed the base of the light, took the industrial strength, because if you unscrew the base of the light pole, there's nothing but wires in there. Yeah. So they knew this. They hooked up their wire to the light from the city, pulled it through the fence, and that was the power. And they also had these incredibly big speakers. And that was my real introduction to that part of what was then called B-Beats. Because the big record was Bongo Rock by an incredible bongo band. And people were breaking, you know. Right. But also they were doing, what else? They doing the freak dance was very, very big uptown. Which was, you know, in the tradition of nasty black dances, the freak dance. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, go ahead, man.
No, it's a time when Blacks, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans. I mean, it was a time when there was a lot of unrest in New York. You know,
well, the city was in it was a dangerous place. Let me just put it that way. And I don't want to romanticize it because it was, you know, when you got in the subway, you put your backpack on, you look both ways. It was really like that. But in the midst of all of that was this great creativity. So out of that. Going to that performance, I interviewed Herc, Clyde Campbell, who was Jamaican, because a lot of the roots of hip hop, there's the sound systems, the dub plates, there's the Latino breakboards. There's a lot of different fusions going on at the same time. Right. And so I wrote an article in July '78. So I might have been to the party a couple of months before. It might have been June or something. It's one of the first articles. It's the first article on Herc. Yeah. And it's one of the first articles on what we now call hip hop. But it's interesting, that was '78. So I don't think the phrase hip hop really took off until maybe '82 or '83. You know, it was later. It was, and I also think, to some degree, the idea that it was one culture was something that sort of came together later. People sort of put them together because some of the breakers, a lot of graph artists aren't into really beat. A lot of graph artists were into punk because they saw themselves as rebels on that level. So, you know, what we call hip hop culture was really an idea that came together as a unified culture. You know,
there's parallels. There's a lot of parallels with punk and all that. Yes, exactly. But the interesting thing is that you were there. Yeah. You were there. We read about it. We watch movies on it. You were there.
Oh, man, listen. You know? I remember I standing in front of the Body Apollo, and there was a Blimpies a couple of blocks away. This is the same period. Yeah. And a guy, you know, like in the movie, the big boom box, and this guy is, you know, hip hop, the hibbit. I'm like, yo, what's up? What's that? And the guy goes, DJ Hollywood, act like you know. You know,
wow. You know, talking to you, it takes me back at a time where I used to, at that time in the early '80s, I lived in upstate New York, a couple hours away from Syracuse, and I remember with my family we drove down to Georgia, and I remember this was around like '84, no, like '85. It's like '85. I remember driving and for the first time in my life actually seeing all the graffiti and
Huh.
feeling this metropolis, this feeling the urban decay, feeling everything that I wanted to be because I'm in upstate New York surrounded by just white kids. And
Right.
so I'm the illest hip hop dude because I'm the only black dude. But being around it and feeling that essence was just something on a whole nother level. And, it's interesting because New York has such a Caribbean influence,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And obviously hip hop is part of that. Those of you that don't know, Herc is basically our hip hop god. We look at him as a person that really pioneered the beginnings of hip hop in New York that spread around the world. And it's interesting because those Jamaican elements of bringing the turntables and the dub plates and all that stuff, right? That is something that 2 years later, around 1980, kind of comes into play with you when you get to sit down with Bob Marley.
Yeah. That's a great story. Bob Marley was on a tour with the Commodores. He could have.
That doesn't even make sense. That's crazy.
Well, it was very strategic on his. I mean,
Yeah.
part of it was he wanted to reach out to a black American audience because at that time he was already a global star. I mean,
Right.
he was already playing to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Europe, Africa, South America, but he had not really penetrated Black America and Black radio. He made that record, Could You Be Loved, which was an absolute record created to penetrate Black radio. And he made a deal with WBLS, which was the #1 Black station. So he did this show with the Commodores. In return, they were going to blast Could You Be Loved in every rotation.
Wow.
So that was one of the reasons he did the gig.
Did not know that.
But of course, so part of his mission to try and reach more Black people was to reach more Black publications. At that time, I was writing for Billboard. I was writing for Amsterdam News. I write for Black fanzines. And so a brother named Lister Ewan Lowe, who was one of the Black executives at the label, got me in to see Bob. And he was staying at the Essex House. I never forget Essex House Hotel, which is on Central Park West. Had a big suite. There were a couple of beautiful women wandering in the background. He sat in a chair. In the interview I did with him, which is in the Nelson George mixtape, he's sitting in a chair with a guitar, barefoot.
Wow.
So he's smoking in between, and I got my little tape recorder. And if you read the interview, like I every question was very precise. I'd written out because he was the first really, really big star that I ever interviewed.
Wow.
And if you read that, he was very interested in making that connection with the global diaspora. That is, how do I connect the Rastafarian religion with the Black American audience with the African? Because also obviously the Rastas are very connected to Ethiopia and so forth.
Right.
So it was amazing because that was a big concern of the last part of his life. Was not just to be a star in to white America or white Europeans, but to make sure that his message, which was very specific about Black empowerment and about Black unity, was also reaching the Black Americans, an audience which was at that point, there was a lot, as you might know, there was a lot of resistance within, and it still is actually, ironically, to the idea of the overall Black diaspora. There was a lot of resistance, I know, in New York to the incoming immigrant community. There were fights in my high school between the Black Americans and the Jamaicans and the Trinis coming in.
Yeah. Yes.
So he was very aware that there was a cultural barrier that did break down over time. But if you see now, there's this whole movement. I think there's a whole movement among certain conservative Black people to oh no, we're not the same as them.
Just to interject for a second, it's interesting because I collect a lot of old Black periodicals and I collect a lot of old Black journals. Right? Black journals that were just different professors writing journals at the time,
Right.
different Black scholars. And the concept of the division between Black Americans and Blacks that immigrated from the Caribbean was something that really blew my mind and is very personal to me, as you know, my family is from Guyana, South America. So it's interesting because it talked about how, you know, we stratified ourselves in America, or some of us did, and there was little things that Black Americans did and or refrained from doing than, you know, that the immigrating Caribbean peoples did. So, for example, in the book or in the journal was talking about, you know, they would come here and see that a lot of us Blacks are louder and rambunctious, so they would try to not do that so that they don't look like some of these Blacks or talk this way. It's just all these little things that just blew my mind when I was reading, because I didn't even really realize this was a thing, you know.
Well, you know what's interesting about that is that the initial group of Caribbean immigrants who made it to the States tended to have a little bit more money. So they were more bougie. That's what like, I remember the cute girls in my high school from Grenada and so forth were very cute and very bougie.
Yes.
But so we all thought, well, okay, they're different than us. But you know what happened? Within a few years, the rude boys started coming
the rude boy.
and suddenly, oh no, they're louder than we are.
Okay, so what's interesting? Check this out. In the journal, I wish I had that journal in front of me, but I didn't really realize that it was tough for the Black Caribbean population to get into the U.S. until the 70s.
Yeah, there was a loosening of immigration policy at some point in the 70s. So you saw the influx. Like, I mean, literally in high school, we went from almost no, by the time I was a freshman, no Caribbean kids to, they were playing soccer in front of the high school by my junior year. Wow. It was really a profound, you know, I always say there used to be a deli near my school that's, when I first went there, they only had knishes, right? And by the time I was graduating, they had beef patties.
And jerk chicken.
Yeah, so and it happened over like a pretty, by the middle of the 70s, it happened over like a 3 or 4 year period where, and so now if you go to Brooklyn, you know, everyone associates Brooklyn with the Caribbean now, Flatbush.
Right.
Is it? You know, that's
I mean, yeah. I have a lot of family there.
Oh yeah.
I have a lot of family there. Yeah.
That happened in the mid 70s, and then there was white flight, as you know.
Of course.
And the white flight, the Caribbean community came in and took over those stores and took over those houses. So it was a pretty profound change, and that, I mean, because when you went to Bob Marley concert in the 70s, it was basically white hipster kids, or the equivalent we called hipsters, right? And you know, and the children of the migration. There weren't that many Black Americans at those shows, at least initially.
Yeah, and it's interesting how he felt that there was a problem in his the delivery of his message, because it was for these Black people that were not showing up.
Yeah.
You know, so it's very interesting. And then also, you know, there's a part in that exact article where he was saying, we're not talking about burning and looting for material goods and things. We only want to destroy capitalist illusions.
Yeah.
You know, can you elaborate upon that concept?
Well, he coming from also interesting enough that Bob was mixed race, which people don't know much about.
Yes.
He had a very strong sense that of white exploitation, and that capitalism was a tool of exploitation, and one that separated us from our essence as people of Africa.
Right.
You know, the contradiction of that, of course, is that Bob himself was living a superstar lifestyle.
Absolutely.
And was staying at the Essex House.
Right.
And it was, was aside from being married, was dating, you know, Miss Jamaica.
Right. By the way, though, the Essex House, isn't that where Donny Hathaway jumped out the window?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It's right on Central Park West. It's one of those, I don't know how elite it is now, but in that era, '80s. It was like a really prime spot. Everyone used to stay there on tour. Yeah, so it has a history. I mean, as you probably know, so I interviewed him in I believe it's late in the year of
In
80.
Yeah.
Sometime that week is the week in which he was playing soccer in Central Park, fell over, and and this cancer was diagnosed.
Wow.
So he did 2 shows in New York with the Commodores. He did one more show in Pittsburgh with the Commodores, and then he went into treatment, and he died about 4 or 5 months later.
Wow.
So it's also one of the last full-on interviews he did before he passed.
Wow. That's crazy. And you've also, you've interviewed so many of my heroes, and this kind of really brings me to a larger discussion here, a larger discussion in regards to just our Black heroes. How I cope with the question I'm about to ask you is I try as hard as I can to separate the art from the person.
Right.
And Marvin Gaye is probably my favorite artist of all time. He wasn't the best person. He had demons.
I think that this year is the I believe it's the 40th anniversary of What's Going On.
71.
50th
Yeah, it would be the 50th.
Yeah.
Wow. Damn.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because he's been through so much.
Right.
And due to his addictions, he did so many kind of, bad things.
Right.
But I love that dude so much, and he inspires me so much, and his work, and I'm able to separate it.
But also the pain and the pain and struggle is in the music. I mean, he was able to take that, whether it's What's Going On, whether it's Here My Dear.
Yeah.
His own internal struggles are nakedly part of his art.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the reasons of all the great soul singers,
yeah,
he's the one who remains the most relevant to younger audiences, because there is a naked vulnerability. He's not lying to you.
Right.
At all. He's not hiding behind the love man thing. He actually in some ways deconstructs the love man thing.
Right. Right.
So I think so. His own faults are part of why we love him.
Absolutely. And when you interviewed him for Village Voice, and he had that big sexual healing comeback after he was abroad for evading taxes and all that stuff, you said the time seemed to call for the kind of social commentary you provided and what's going on. Give me your perspective. Why did you say that to him, and what was his response to you? Well,
he basically said, that kind of thing requires a lot of thought, a lot of fasting. I just think that What's Going On is a perfect storm. It's the 70s. We're moving from civil rights into Black power. There's also a movement within white music of, the Sgt. Peppers and so forth. The conceptual album is happening. Mm. His own brother I think his brother had done, Frankie done maybe 3 tours of Vietnam. So he's getting that.
And he was writing him letters. Yeah, and that's what inspired him. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then also, there's a great story. What's Going On? People think that Marvin came up with the idea. Originally, it was Obie Benson, who's one of the Four Tops, had written a sort of lyric for What's Going On. He then took it to Al Cleveland, who's one of those many amazing Motown songwriters, and they were collaborating. Mm. And then they said, okay, let's try and see if Marvin wants it. They took it to Marvin. Marvin initially was going to give it to another group that he was producing. And then eventually he took it on, and then he transformed it with his lyrical inventions and his melodic input, made that into basically a single, and that became the prototype for the album. So one of the things about Marvin is that he was an incredibly great collaborative artist, whether it was with Harvey Fuqua, who produced a lot of his great music, mm-hmm. or collaborating with Diana Ross, or working later on the After the Dance album with Jesus, I just drew blank.
Leon Ware. Yeah.
So Marvin always was able to take what people brought and elevate it.
Yes.
But I do think that what's going on came out of all those that moment in his life. And I don't know if he was able or even willing to go back to that level of pain.
Well, Tammy Terrell had passed.
That's right. There was so many, like I said, there's all these different, you can see all these threads that lead to what's going on. After what's going on, his main preoccupation was his sex life. Or his conflicted sex life.
Right.
And he made some of the greatest, love music. I mean, the I Want You album is just...
Yo, man, that's one of my favorite albums of all time. It's funny because I always think about, do I like that more or do I like What's Going On more? And I can't figure it out. I feel like What's Going On is the more important album, but I Want You, to me, is the more enjoyable album.
Oh, yeah. Because, it's about sensuality. I mean, after the dance, come on, man. So What's Going On is probably... Absolutely, in terms of its range of social, Holy Holy's on there, which Aretha later covered. God Is Love. It's a deep, deep record. It's not a record you can always go back to on a daily basis because it's challenging.
Well, what's interesting to me, like black music, secular music, the meaning of secular music, leaving secular music to create the quote devil's music. Marvin is creating the devil's music and then putting God's name in it. And then he gets killed by his cross-dressing father that abused him. But at the same time, Marvin was abusing the family and was high and crazy. Like, there's so much that happens here,
Yeah.
And just like you said, the transparency in regards to his pain is captured within the music.
No one who else has made a double album about their divorce? I mean, it's a double album.
Yeah, I know, man. It's
Hear My Dear. I mean, that was one of the records that took me a while. I was like afraid to even crack that because we're talking about being vulnerable and being in pain. It's a document that most black artists, it's interesting. Most black artists back then, maybe even now, they're confined by commercialism. They have to make hit records. They have to make, a lot of hip hop artists have been able to be more intimate, I guess. But at that time, it was very hard, almost, with the exception of a Gil Scott or a few other artists, to be that vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And be allowed to be that vulnerable in a public space, to do the kind of confessional work that we associate with, Paul Simon or Joni Mitchell.
It's a different time too. The 80s is different from the 70s, different from the 60s. It's a lot more sterile from instrumentation and everything. But something that's interesting though, as we talk about Marvin, as we talk about Bob, in '83, you wrote an article in reference to Michael Jackson's Thriller. And you said that you were so perplexed that a new black artist could connect with white mainstream to such a degree. You said the last one to do something like that was Diana Ross. At that time, you're talking about Thriller that recently came out.
Yeah.
Did you know that Thriller would be what it would be and Michael Jackson would be who he became at that time?
Oh, no. I mean, remember, Off the Wall had sold 9 million records. He already hit, Off the Wall was a massive hit.
Right.
For any artist.
Right.
And certainly for a black. So he already was at a certain level that was almost unprecedented. Mm-hmm. So to come back and sell, 40 million, whatever insane number it finally ended up at, no one could have predicted that. That also, again, it's also, we can't, and he also was a genius of visuals. And so the music video.
Yes.
I mean, when Beat It video came out, that was a major, that was a cultural shifting moment. And then he did Thriller.
Here's something that you actually wrote. You said Billie Jean is Thriller's most stylish tune. Beat It, clearly its most influential, but because it is also the most frankly rock-oriented. Not only was it the linchpin which linked black music to AOR radio, thanks in part in the presence of a white guitar god, rest in peace now, obviously, Eddie Van Halen, but it managed to straddle the racist barrier erected by MTV. You're talking about this at that time, as well as opening the door to the medium with which Michael's charisma has since achieved its fullest expression. No, that's November of '83.
Yeah,
so
man.
I remember that time. I was young, but I remember that time he was an absolute god. But there's so many people today that don't even understand the concept of what a superstar actually is. That was a time when most of us only had 6 or 7 channels on our television station. That's a time when we listened to the radio every day. There was no internet. If you were on TV, you were on TV. If you were on MTV, you were on MTV. My mother always makes fun of me because she talks about how much I used to play the Thriller VHS tape. So, he really expanded the demographic to everybody.
I mean, think about this, man. Lionel Richie, Whitney Houston, Prince. I'm sure there's a bunch of other records I'm not thinking about. Tina Turner's crossover. That's all made possible by Thriller, by the fact that it pushed the boundaries of the door open about what was possible to be achieved by a black artist. So that, I mean, there's one of the great. So I was at Billboard back then, and there was a Michael Jackson special issue, and it's all Michael Jackson all the time. But the back cover was brought out by Warner Brothers, and it was a picture of purple with little raindrops, and it said, "The purple rain is coming."
Ooh, wow.
And so Prince was already dreaming about how do I compete at that level. And so Michael did videos. Prince was determined to do a movie. Right?
Oh, wow. Right. That's
right.
right.
How do I top that?
Right.
And then, when Whitney came out, even though Whitney did very different kinds of music, she sold I forgot the exact 9 million. It was an insane. No woman had ever sold that many records. So the possibilities of what a black artist could be. The Can't Slow Down album by Lionel Richie, in a way, is his own little Thriller. If you go back and listen to the album now.
Yo, you know what's something? I say to people that Lionel Richie, when you listen to the production, like if you're just talking about just high fidelity analog production at the time, that was up there with Thriller. If you just listen, you don't gotta like it. Just listen to the production. It's extremely hi-fi.
Let me tell you something. There's a man who doesn't get enough credit. His name is James Anthony Carmichael. He was Lionel Richie's producer. He started with the Commodores, and he did, Easy, all of the things that Lionel did there. He also produced a band called Atlantic Star.
I didn't know he produced Atlantic Star.
Yeah. And those records are really, really well made as well.
Yes.
So it's funny because I don't know much. I've never even seen a picture of James Anthony Carmichael.
Yeah.
But he was Lionel from the Commodores all the way through his solo career. And those records are immaculate.
What's crazy too is so me and Ali Shaheed we recently finished up a documentary on Rick James for Showtime, and it's insane. It's insane.
With who?
It's going to be coming out on Showtime. It's a documentary on Rick James.
It's on Rick James?
We just finished scoring it. It's insane. It's insane.
Yeah.
You think and you watch it and you're just like, yo, what the hell? So it's what's interesting is they talked about. I'm just letting it all go now, but there's this one part where Motown said, "We ain't dealing with you anymore, Rick," because of his antics, and they put all that money behind Lionel at that time, and that is what helped to put Lionel up on that whole new pedestal now. So it's interesting. But what's really interesting to me, from Bob Marley to Michael Jackson and Marvin Gaye, is that now race music is really hitting a whole new height. And blacks are having new heroes that are being exalted in white media. So as you're writing on these people, how do you see things changing as far as just the openness or the willingness to have blacks on the forefront. I guess some in a musical way, something that is somewhat analogous to the blaxploitation era of the 70s.
Well, but I think you also have to put in the fact that Eddie Murphy is an
Right.
unprecedented star.
Right.
There's Wynton Marsalis and his brother Branford are
Yes.
these jazz stars. There's Brian Gumbel on Today's Show.
Yes.
Oprah Winfrey.
Cosby Show.
Cosby Show. So
Yeah.
so it was not just the music. There was a whole wave of black pop culture
Yes.
that made all of these people. I mean, Cosby's in disrepute now, but Bill Cosby was America's father.
Absolutely.
Number
He
one
was
show in
black.
the country
Yeah.
for
Yes.
years.
Yes.
So all of this stuff is going on at this level of black acceptance, which the argument can be made, and people have made it, that this leads to Obama eventually. The idea of the black pop acceptable crossover star. One of the big concepts of that era was the phrase crossover. How do I go from a black audience to a mass white audience? And there were various strategies to that. And that's the dominant ideology in pop music and in pop culture up until the late 80s, when hip hop starts to change the dynamic.
To add to that, it's more so, how do I get my record label to categorize my album as pop instead of urban, so I can have the pop budget attached to what I'm doing?
One of the issues that funny, one of Andre Harrell, who passed last year, one of his big bones of contention with MCA Records was that Mary J. Blige and Jodeci were not given the same at MCA, the same push that Bobby Brown got at MCA, or that for Vet Keefe, that some of the other. He always felt that at that particular institution, his artists were ghettoized within a certain level of promotion, which is one of the ironies of Puffy when he left Uptown to go work and start Bad Boy at Arista, is that Clive Davis had already figured out that black was pop with Whitney. Mm-hmm. And if you look back at TLC,
Gil Scott,
success,
he brought Gil Scott over too. Right.
But in terms of actual selling of tons of records, he'd already figured out a certain way to do that. He believed in that. So he took Biggie, he took TLC, he took Outkast. They were able to take records, but like One More Chance, and take records like that and make those into pop records. That was like it was one of the highest debuting singles of all time, the Biggie remix of One More Chance. So, by the 90s, the idea of what crossed over was different. You didn't have to be quite as accommodating you didn't have to do like James Ingram ballads.
Right.
You could do, One More Chance. You could do Waterfalls. You could do all of those records that came through that More Money, More Problems. So I mean, the idea of success changed. Hip hop changed how you crossed over, I would say. In fact, you made people cross over to you.
Right. And I'll close on this last question here. It's interesting how hip hop really kind of opened the doors to us becoming pop when NWA took over the charts from REM. All these unprecedented things were happening. But if we go back even 20 more years, when we had Motown and when we had Stax, Motown was the bubblegum, and I feel like Stax was more unapologetically black, So it's, you obviously know which label was the more successful label, obviously Motown, but you have seen all this evolve into what we have today now, where we have a lot of black artists that's just releasing their own music, So it's just interesting that we're here.
Well, listen, man, I mean, the Motown thing, I always think Motown gets a bit of a bad rap in retrospect because they're judging those records, well, it's bubblegum, but if you listen to I Want You Back, That's an amazing record.
It's amazing.
How
it's amazing.
Made. It's
yeah.
insane.
Amazing.
You listen to Standing in the Shadows of Love.
Yeah.
The range of stuff that came out of Motown was much wider than just the pop hits, or the biggest pop hits.
Yes.
You know, one of my favorite Motown records is Function at the Junction by Shorty Long, which is funky as hell.
Yeah.
So there was a lot more going on there than just, and a lot of what Marvin and young Stevie was doing.
Tammy.
Yeah, exactly.
But also,
I just feel like that the production line and the quality. I mean, I go back. I marvel at the range of songwriters at Motown.
Yeah.
So the Ozzy Brothers made This Old Heart of Mine. That people don't even come on.
Yeah.
Great records.
And I agree with you. When I use the term bubblegum in reference to Motown, Motown's music is extremely black. It just happened to cross over, but it was a formula of black music that was, I guess, the product was more sterilized. The product being not just the music, but what came with it, as far as how everybody dressed,
exactly.
how they carried themselves, and that's what made it, quote, bubblegum. Because they were still as raw as polished as they were, was as raw as they were. Stax didn't have that polish, and it was more unapologetically black. This is who we are, and this is what it is. Even though both labels still carry the same kind of messages, generally speaking, over the years, but we all know how Berry Gordy felt with the What's Going On when that transition started to happen.
And the funny thing about Stax, of course, is that the key band on Stax, Booker T and MG's, is integrated band.
Yes, absolutely.
The bass player and the guitar player are white.
Absolutely. I've spoken with David Porter about everything there. It's interesting because I also talked to just David Porter about the kind of racism that they had to deal with back then, and but I say this all to say, actually, one thing that he was telling me about was that when they made Soul Man, just the little messages that they would put in there, just like the black codes that they would put in there. There's a lot of songs where they're speaking just to black people, and if you weren't black, you wouldn't really understand what they were saying. But
absolutely,
the point is though, when you look at the evolution of black music in America, I always say that black music is an expression of the relationship between black and white America. And it's interesting to read your books and your articles on the etiology of our acceptance, and I want to thank you for everything that you've done, everything that you're doing. What's next for you so that everybody in the world know what they could be tuned into?
Well, I'm a executive producer on a Tupac and Afeni documentary, 5-part documentary for FX. It won't be out for another year. We're still in the weeds digging on it, but it's fascinating because a lot of it, his mother is more fascinating than Tupac.
Yeah.
Afeni Shakur, she's an amazing woman. So a lot of I think Tupac will be he's the thing that people will watch it for, and they're going to come away with an introduction to a radical visionary who raised him.
Wow.
So I think it's the next big thing coming out.
Looking forward to that. Make sure you guys search everything Nelson George because he never comes whack. Thank you, my brother.
Thank you,
for being a part of this. Cool.
Appreciate it. This is Nelson George, and you are tuned in to Invisible Blackness.